Science.
The circumstances surrounding the incident were complex and involved multiple external factors that were not initially apparent.
What happens when a Congresswoman schools a Supreme Court justice on his own constitution? The question alone feels unthinkable. Power is supposed to flow in the opposite direction, from the high bench down to the chambers, from robes that command deference to the elected who must defer. Yet on this day, that familiar current reversed, and every eye in the room caught the shift. The air was heavy before the exchange even began, the way it feels before a storm breaks. Brett Kavanaugh sat steady, practiced in his posture, leaning into the authority he carried like a shield. To the casual glance, he looked untouchable. But Jasmine Crockett didn't see the shield. She saw the cracks. She entered the room not with bluster, but with a steady calm that drew attention more sharply than a shout. Her confidence wasn't loud. It was precise, sharpened to a blade's edge. The kind of confidence that comes from knowing the words, the law, the truth are all loaded behind you like ammunition. When she opened her folder, silence rippled. Papers could be weapons if the person holding them knew exactly where to aim. She lifted her head and spoke, and the first question landed with a weight no one could ignore. Justice Kavanaugh, if the Constitution is clear on the limits of power, why do your rulings stretch its meaning to the breaking point? The room tilted. Kavanaugh shifted, a flicker in the eyes, a tightening at the jaw, small tells, but in politics and law, small tells can turn into earthquakes. He leaned back, searching for the familiar refuge of formality, the measured cadence that so often drowns challengers in legalese. But Crockett pressed forward. Her tone wasn't aggressive. It was surgical. Each word trimmed away the pretense. Each sentence carried the force of generations who had been promised rights, only to see them bent, narrowed, denied. The audience felt it too. Whispers swelled. Phones lifted to record. The battle was no longer contained to a marble chamber. It was bleeding outward to feeds, to timelines, to millions waiting for the clip. Kavanaugh's reply began, slow, deliberate, a search for footing on ground already shifting beneath him. But what he said next no one saw coming. To understand why this moment mattered, you need the backdrop. Because this was never just a sharp exchange between two public figures. It was a collision of histories, symbols, and powers that rarely cross paths in public view. It was the Constitution itself. Who owns it, who speaks for it, who gets to interpret its promises, suddenly dragged into the spotlight of a single room. The Supreme Court has long been cloaked in mystique. Its justices speak with an air of permanence, every opinion weighted with centuries of authority. Brett Kavanaugh came to that bench draped in controversy, a man confirmed through firestorms of hearings that divided the nation. For some, he embodied the stability of tradition. For others, he symbolized a system where privilege shields power from accountability. Every decision he cast, every line he wrote into the law, carried echoes of that division. And then there was Jasmine Crockett, the Congresswoman few expected to rise with such force. Her path was not paved by legacy or elite networks. It was carved from community work, legal battles in courtrooms where the stakes were not theoretical but immediate. She was forged in the fights where real people needed real protections, where the Constitution wasn't an abstraction but the line between justice and betrayal. Her ascent was proof that voice and grit could breach the guarded walls of Washington. So when these two figures faced each other, it was not on equal footing. On paper, Kavanaugh held the upper hand, a lifetime appointment, robes that conferred untouchable gravitas. But power is not always what it looks like on parchment. Sometimes power is the voice that dares to challenge, to interrupt the ritual silence with inconvenient truths. And that is why this mattered. Because this wasn't just about law. It was about who gets to define truth. Is truth decreed from above, pressed down from marble steps, written in complex legal jargon that keeps ordinary people outside its gates? Or is truth spoken plainly, carried in the cadence of someone who remembers what it's like to fight for rights not yet delivered? In this clash, Crockett embodied the second vision. She walked into that chamber not only as herself, but as a vessel of frustration, of hope, of a people tired of being told the Constitution belongs to someone else. She became the mirror reflecting a question at Kavanaugh: who do you believe this document is for? The room itself seemed to understand the stakes. Journalists scribbled furiously. Cameras tightened their focus, every lens straining to capture not just the words, but the energy pulsing beneath them. Viewers at home would later describe the scene as surreal. The justice expected to hold court suddenly forced to defend himself. The Congresswoman expected to sit quietly in awe, suddenly commanding the room, and all of it framed by the deeper storm outside. A nation divided over rulings that reshaped rights, a public that no longer trusted the impartiality of the court. and a Congress wrestling with its own crisis of legitimacy. The clash between Crockett and Kavanaugh wasn't just about their exchange. It became shorthand for the larger battle. Courts versus Congress, elite power versus democratic representation, interpretation versus lived reality. Every step of Crockett's rise made her ready for this moment. Every shadow over Kavanaugh's past made it impossible to ignore. And as the two locked eyes, one with the certainty of preparation, the other with the weight of a legacy under scrutiny, the silence of that chamber turned into something else. Anticipation, because everyone sensed what was coming next, history bending in real time. Brett Kavanaugh did not stumble into power. He was carried there by currents most Americans never touch. Prep schools polished his edges, Ivy League halls affirmed his intellect, and the corridors of Washington welcomed him like a son of their own. From the outside, his path looked inevitable. A man bred for the bench, wrapped in the assurance that doors would always open and voices of dissent could be shut out with a gavel strike. When his nomination to the Supreme Court came, it should have been the crowning moment of a carefully scripted career. Instead, it erupted into one of the most contentious confirmation battles in living memory. The hearings were raw, the allegations searing, the nation divided between defenders and accusers. Kavanaugh's voice, cracking with rage, echoed across televisions as he declared his innocence. To some, his defiance read as strength. To others, it reeked of entitlement, the fury of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. And yet, he survived. The robe was fitted, the seat secured, the oath sworn. The court absorbed him, and for years, he sat among its marble pillars with the aura of insulation that comes with lifetime power. He issued opinions with the cool detachment expected of a justice, but beneath the detachment lay something else, a confidence that criticism could not touch him, that consequences were relics reserved for others. That aura followed him into every chamber he entered. He was supposed to tower, not just physically, but symbolically, as the living embodiment of law's authority. His presence carried the weight of precedent, of centuries of decisions that shaped the lives of millions. When he leaned back in his chair, it was not merely comfort but performance, a reminder that his words did not end. When he stopped speaking, they echoed through history. But cracks were always there, even if faint. The rigidity of his tone, the way his explanations stretched simple truths into complex webs, the occasional flash of irritation when pressed too far. Those who watched closely sensed the fragility beneath the performance, the possibility that, when cornered, the justice might falter not with dignity, but with frustration. And that irony hung over him like a shadow, a justice who interprets the law, suddenly on trial by it. Because in the chamber where Jasmine Crockett sat waiting, the scales were not tilted by tradition or deference. They were leveled by preparation, by clarity, by the audacity to ask the questions most were too hesitant to voice. Kavanaugh's backstory was supposed to shield him, to make him untouchable. Instead, it set the stage for the unraveling to come. For every privilege, every insulation, every time he had been carried forward by power, all of it now sharpened the drama of what it would mean to be held accountable. He entered that room with the weight of history on his side. By the time it was over, history would feel heavier than ever. Jasmine Crockett was never meant to be the one who rattled the pillars of power. That's what made her rise remarkably. In the polished world of Washington, where pedigrees often mattered more than purpose, she arrived with a background that spoke not to privilege but to persistence. She was not carved from marble like the statues that lined the halls. She was forged in the heat of community fights, in cramped courtrooms where lives hung in the balance and the Constitution was not an abstract relic but a living document people clung to for survival. Before she ever entered Congress, Crockett had earned her reputation as a relentless attorney. She defended clients who could not defend themselves, parsed legal codes not to impress but to protect. Her training was not theoretical, it was lived. Every case, every client, every late-night combing through precedent taught her the same truth. The Constitution mattered only if someone dared to wield it. That courage became her armor in politics. Where others softened their words for comfort, she sharpened hers for clarity. Where others dodged, she confronted, and where many underestimated her, a freshman, a woman of color, an outsider, she quietly prepared. She studied the Constitution not as a trophy but as a toolkit. So when she walked into the chamber facing Brett Kavanaugh, she did not bring awe. She brought readiness. Her presence that day told its own story. She didn't need grandeur to command attention. The steadiness in her eyes, the deliberate rhythm of her movements, the way she carried silence as if it were a weapon, all of it drew focus. In a room where authority was expected to flow only in one direction, she was rewriting the script with nothing more than presence. She wasn't supposed to win this exchange. That was the unspoken truth. A justice sat before her, cloaked in lifetime power, while she was just another elected official, one voice among hundreds. The imbalance was obvious. And yet, in that imbalance lay her advantage. She carried no illusions about the hierarchy. She did not need to uphold it. Her only duty was to speak clearly, to make the Constitution visible again to everyone watching. The empathy she carried for those outside the chamber, the ordinary citizens whose rights often felt like bargaining chips, gave her words weight long before she spoke them. Every phrase she had prepared was sharpened not against abstract arguments, but against real lives. That was her edge of the law, was not theory to her. It was testimony, and so she waited poised, steady, every second building tension in the chamber. The audience leaned forward, sensing something unfamiliar. Even the marble walls seemed to anticipate a shift, and when she finally spoke, the room shifted. The first strike was not loud, but it landed like a thunderclap. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, voice steady, eyes locked, and asked a question so plain that it sliced through the chamber's heavy air. Justice Kavanaugh, when the Constitution outlines separation of powers, where exactly does it grant you authority to stretch beyond what's written? It was not an attack. It was a scalpel, and that made it more dangerous. Kavanaugh straightened, his hands folding over each other with the poise of someone rehearsed in deflection. His tone carried the polished cadence of the bench, words stretched long with formality. Congresswoman, the Constitution must be understood not in fragments, but in its whole tradition. But Crockett was already leaning in again, refusing to let the mist of abstraction swallow the point. Tradition doesn't overrule text, so I'll ask again, where is it written? The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged. The audience, staffers, journalists, and even aides along the walls felt the shift. Kavanaugh blinked, recalibrating, but the firmness of her repetition closed off the escape routes he usually found in grand phrasing. And so began the rhythm: strike, deflect, cut. Mini dramas unfolded with each question. Crockett pressed on voting rights, citing exact clauses, the ink on the parchment almost echoing through her tone. Kavanaugh deflected with precedent, with the idea that interpretation evolves. She countered by quoting the framers, stripping the argument back to the foundation. Each time he reached higher into theory, she grounded the debate lower, back into the text, back into the clarity of words anyone could read. With every exchange, tension mounted. Viewers watching the live feed later would say it felt like watching a high-stakes chess match, except one side kept trying to play with smoke while the other pushed real pieces forward on the board. The audience felt vindicated. For once, the underdog was not retreating, not being drowned in jargon. Each rebuttal was like a spark igniting murmurs, a ripple of recognition across the room. Crockett wasn't just challenging Kavanaugh. She was challenging the aura that had long shielded the court itself. Kavanaugh's jaw tightened. His responses grew longer, more layered, as if piling words atop one another might create a barricade. But Crockett had the discipline of precision. She asked small questions with massive implications, each one narrowing his room to maneuver. Does the Constitution empower the court to make rights conditional? She asked, voice unwavering. The court interprets rights within. He began. So, that's a no. The interruption was surgical, the kind that left him no space to retreat without conceding ground. His pause was only a second, but in that second, the chamber felt his unease. Every flicker in his expression became a story. Every hesitation carried weight. The authority that once seemed untouchable now looked human, breakable, exposed. And still, Crockett pressed. Her tone never escalated, it didn't need to. She carried the momentum of someone certain not only of her footing but of her responsibility. Each word was for those listening beyond the walls, the millions who had been told that constitutional language was too complicated for them to understand. Her voice told them otherwise, that the text was theirs, that clarity belonged to them. Kavanaugh, for all his practiced composure, began to reveal the smallest cracks. His fingers shifted on the table, his shoulders pressed back tighter. His eyes darted downward just a second too long. These were not breakdowns, they were fissures. But in the language of power, fissures are louder than speeches. The room was no longer neutral. It was leaning. The authority once draped over Kavanaugh now seemed to gather around Crockett. Each rebuttal, each calm insistence on clarity, pulled the weight toward her side. And yet, just when it seemed the exchange might settle into a pattern, Crockett shifted gears. She dropped a question not about abstract power, but about precedent tied directly to his own past rulings. The chamber stilled. The justice, who had lived for years insulated from public cross-examination, suddenly found himself answering for decisions in front of someone unwilling to soften the edges. The emotional stakes spiked. Viewers later would say their hearts quickened, not because of shouting, but because of the sheer audacity of the scene. A congresswoman turning the nation's constitution back on one of its highest interpreters. And still, it wasn't over. Because every time Kavanaugh sought refuge in authority, Crockett met him with text. Every time he leaned on tradition, she met him with present reality. And with each volley, the sense grew that this was not merely a debate. It was an unveiling. The Constitution was no longer distant, no longer guarded by marble and robes. It was in Crockett's hands, clear and sharp, exposed for all to see. And though Kavanaugh still sat cloaked in title, the tension in his posture betrayed a deeper truth. Authority was slipping. But it wasn't over yet. The breaking point was still ahead. The chamber air had already grown taut, but now it felt electric. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but vibrating, as if everyone present knew something irreversible was about to happen. For the first time, Justice Brett Kavanaugh showed it openly discomfort. His chin tilted downward, his eyes narrowed, his lips pressed together in the tight line of someone who had lost control of the narrative. He shifted in his chair, fingers adjusting his pen though he wasn't writing. The movements were small, but in a room calibrated to power, every flicker was amplified. Jasmine Crockett had pulled him to the edge, and now she was about to tip him over. Her voice, calm and deliberate, cut through the murmurs. "Justice Kavanaugh, I'd like to revisit something you once said. Not decades ago, not in some private discussion, but in your own confirmation hearing." The words hit like a gavel. She was not introducing her own argument now. She was flipping the script, making him answer to himself. She read directly, crisp and unwavering. "No one is above the law. Judges must interpret the Constitution as it is written, not as they wish it to be." The irony hung heavy. The justice had once pledged fidelity to text, but now, cornered by Crockett's earlier challenges, he had leaned on tradition, interpretation, and whole context. The contradiction was sharp and the betrayal twist stung. He was on trial not by Congress but by his own words. The chamber reacted instantly. A ripple of gasps, stifled laughs, and the unmistakable sound of pens scratching notes. Kavanaugh's face tightened further, as if the marble facade he'd relied upon his entire career was beginning to crack. He tried to pivot, voice rising a fraction louder than before, a break in composure. "Congresswoman, those remarks were in reference to..." But she didn't let him finish. "They were in reference to the Constitution, and I've just quoted them verbatim. So again, Justice, are you now telling this body that you meant something different when you said those words?" The confrontation was no longer abstract. It was personal, tethered to his name, his reputation, his credibility. Kavanaugh exhaled slowly, stalling. But the stall only deepened the perception of weakness, and Crockett pressed further. "You cite precedent when convenient, but dismiss it when inconvenient. For example," she lifted another sheet of paper, eyes locked forward. "In your opinion on XYZ United States a fictional placeholder case, you affirmed the primacy of original text. Yet today, when asked directly about constitutional boundaries, you retreated into tradition. Which is it, Justice, text or tradition?" It was the betrayal layered again, his own precedent weaponized against him. The audience didn't just hear an argument, they saw the unraveling of authority in real time. The cameras zoomed in. Later screenshots would go viral. Kavanaugh's tightened jaw, his reddened cheeks, the faint gloss in his eyes as he blinked more often than usual. Crockett, by contrast, remained composed, almost serene, the image of conviction against power. Social media lit up instantly. Hashtags exploded across platforms. "But Crockett vs. Kavanaugh, a constitutional showdown, no one above the law." Memes circulated within minutes, split screens of Kavanaugh quoting, "Judges must interpret as written," against his flustered responses. One viral comment read, "He just got cross-examined by his own ghost." Another, "Crockett didn't just school him, she handed him his own homework, and failed him." The emotional crescendo reached its peak when she leaned forward for the final thrust. "Justice Kavanaugh, the Constitution is not a mirror for your preferences. It's a contract with the people. You swore to uphold it. So I'll ask plainly, have you honored that oath, or have you betrayed it?" The room froze. The phrasing was deliberate, devastating. Betrayal, a word that carries weight beyond politics, moral weight. It framed the exchange not as disagreement, but as a breach of trust. Kavanaugh opened his mouth, then closed it again. The pause stretched long enough to tell its own story. For a man who had built a career on fluent legal rhetoric, silence was louder than any speech, and with that silence, the reversal was complete. The justice, expected to tower in authority, now sat diminished. Crockett, underestimated as an underdog, stood ascendant. The power dynamic had flipped, and everyone in the chamber felt it. Journalists scrambled to draft headlines that captured the moment. Crockett turns Kavanaugh's words against him. Justice cornered by his own precedents. A constitutional showdown for the ages. Meanwhile, the live comment streams flooded with disbelief and celebration. One viewer wrote, "History isn't supposed to happen on a Tuesday morning in a hearing room. And yet here we are." Another declared, "This wasn't just a debate. This was accountability live." The layering of audience reaction created its own chorus. Inside the chamber, hushed murmurs swirled as aides exchanged glances. Outside, the digital world roared. It felt less like politics and more like a cultural moment. The kind of event that fractures timelines into before and after. Kavanaugh, visibly shaken, attempted to recover. He spoke about judicial independence, about the dangers of political pressure. But his words now carried less weight. They felt defensive, self-serving. Crockett didn't need to respond with fire. Her silence was enough. She had already won the exchange, and yet the significance wasn't merely personal. It was constitutional theater with real stakes. A justice normally shielded by robes and precedent had been pulled down into confrontation and found wanting. A Congresswoman, dismissed by critics as too blunt, too fiery, had stood not only as an equal but as the sharper mind. As the hearing adjourned, the crowd buzzed with the sense that something irreversible had transpired. Staffers hurried, journalists typed furiously, and social feeds continued to explode. The narrative was set, authority had been shaken, and clarity had prevailed. For Crockett, it was more than a victory. It was an emergence. She had proven that text and truth could still cut through titles and traditions. For Kavanaugh, it was exposure. The marble facade of judicial untouchability had cracked, and the world had seen what lay beneath. The crowd saw history, but the fallout had just begun. The hearing was no longer about two individuals sparring across a desk. It had evolved into something larger, something elemental, a moral showdown over what the Constitution truly meant, and who it ultimately belonged to. Justice Brett Kavanaugh had arrived cloaked in centuries of judicial authority. Lifetime appointment. Marble chambers, deferences baked into tradition. His very presence carried the suggestion that the Constitution resided within the courts, locked behind doors that only men like him could open. But in this room, Jasmine Crockett shattered that illusion. She leaned into the microphone, voice steady but fierce, and declared, "The Constitution was never written for robes. It was written for the people." The words reverberated. They cut through legal jargon and institutional hierarchy with startling simplicity. Law as a weapon of control. That was the old story, the one Kavanaugh embodied with every careful deflection. But law as a tool of justice, a shield for the powerless, that was the story Crockett told, and it was suddenly undeniable. Her phrasing reframed the entire clash. No longer was she the underdog, no longer was he the untouchable arbiter. Instead, he was cornered, his authority stripped bare. Each attempt at recovery only deepened the divide. He fidgeted, adjusting his notes that no longer seemed useful. His pen tapped the desk, once, twice, then stopped as though even the sound betrayed his unease. His eyes flicked toward the clock, a small betrayal of the instinct to escape. The contrast could not have been clearer. Crockett, unshaken and luminous, speaking with the resonance of lived experience. Kavanaugh, shrinking into rhetorical silence, a man whose power no longer protected him. For those watching, the emotional tide turned from tension to revelation. This wasn't just a debate. It was an unveiling. A mask slipped, and behind it, an uncomfortable truth was revealed. Power without humility becomes fragility. Authority without accountability becomes exposure. Crockett pressed the moment further, not with aggression but with conviction. When law becomes a privilege, it ceases to be law. When interpretation becomes a shield for the powerful, it betrays the people it was written to serve. Her words landed like a verdict. Not the kind pronounced from a bench, but the kind etched into memory. Around the room, you could see heads nodding, aides scribbling, even skeptics struck still by the weight of her clarity. Kavanaugh tried once more to speak. His voice cracked faintly. Just a tremor, but noticeable. He began with all due respect. But the phrase faltered, half swallowed by the thick air of the chamber. Respect was no longer his to command, and in that moment the theme flipped completely. Power shifted into humility. Arrogance curdled into exposure. The once dominant justice sat silent, unable to summon the words that had carried him through hearings, arguments, and decades of polished authority. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her composure carried its own triumph. She had reframed the Constitution not as parchment in archives, not as precedent stacked in law libraries, but as the living heartbeat of a people who had too often been silenced. She had made it visible again. And the audience felt it. You could sense vindication ripple like a current through the chamber, not loud, not theatrical, but deep. It was the quiet gasp of history turning, the collective recognition that something foundational had just shifted. Journalists scribbled furiously. Staffers whispered in the back. The cameras lingered on Kavanaugh's tightened jaw, his hand clenched around a pen that never touched the page. Later, those images would be replayed endlessly, the justice frozen in awkward silence while a congresswoman rewrote the power script before the nation's eyes. Crockett's closing words crystallized the moral victory. The Constitution doesn't belong to 9 justices. It doesn't belong to one chamber or one party. It belongs to the people. And when it is ignored, twisted, or hidden, the people deserve to see it reclaimed. There it was, not just a point, but a revelation. A moral line drawn in real time. For Kavanaugh, the silence stretched again, each second heavier than the last. He looked down at his notes, but his eyes never settled. The robe of authority he once wore so easily now hung invisible, useless. And for Crockett, the silence was victory. She didn't just speak over him. She outlasted him. She left the chamber not as an agitator, but as a truth teller, carrying the moral clarity of someone who had turned the nation's most sacred text back toward its rightful owners. The showdown was complete. The law, stripped of pretense, had been reclaimed before the eyes of millions. But the ripple effect outside that room, even bigger. The chamber didn't roar. It didn't need to. The silence itself became its own verdict. Justice Brett Kavanaugh sat in the heavy quiet, his jaw stiff, his eyes unfocused, his notes a blur of words that no longer carried weight. The authority he'd worn like armor seemed to sag, invisible but unmistakable. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't celebrate. She didn't smirk or grandstand or gloat. She simply straightened in her chair, her composure unbroken, her calm almost luminous. That restraint was its own message. The work had been done, the point had been made, and history would remember without embellishment. It was the kind of scene that lingers in collective memory, not because of fireworks, but because of reversal. For once, the Constitution wasn't abstract, a tool hidden in marble halls and cloaked in legalese. For once, it was alive in the hands of someone willing to speak plainly, directly, and fearlessly. Crockett had made it breathe. Kavanaugh's reaction, the pauses, the stumbles, the silence, spoke louder than any ruling. It was discomfort captured on camera, unease etched into posture, the look of someone realizing their domain had been breached by clarity too sharp to deflect. And outside that room, the world felt it. Social media erupted. Clips spread within minutes. Crockett leaning in, voice precise, cutting through evasions, Kavanaugh blinking, shifting, stammering. Comments piled up like a wavy. She just gave him a constitutional clinic. Finally, someone said it plain. This is history in real time. The moment transcended politics. It became a cultural spark, but the deeper resonance was quieter, more personal. Viewers who had long felt excluded from constitutional debates, ordinary people told the text was too dense, too complicated, too distant, suddenly saw themselves reflected. They saw the Constitution as theirs again, not locked away, not reserved for courts or elites. Crockett became a symbol of that reclamation. Her defiance was not loud, but it was unyielding. Her clarity was not theatrical, but it was devastating. In that balance, dignity without compromise, precision without hesitation, she embodied a new kind of authority, one rooted not in robes or appointments, but in truth made visible. And so the resolution unfolded not as a singular victory, but as a reminder. The law belongs to the people, not just the powerful. The Constitution is not the property of a court or a chamber. It is the inheritance of a nation. Crockett's performance etched that truth into the record, turning what could have been a routine hearing into a revelation. The catharsis was palpable. For the audience, for those watching live, for those replaying the clips later, there was satisfaction in seeing the imbalance corrected, if only for a moment. The mighty had been humbled. The underestimated had triumphed. The people's text had spoken for itself. Crockett didn't need to declare victory. The room itself testified. Her calm exit, her quiet dignity was its own exclamation point. And as the cameras faded, as the headlines rolled in, one lesson lingered: simple and unforgettable power is borrowed. Truth is permanent. And in that chamber, before the eyes of millions, the truth had finally been reclaimed. Jasmine Crockett didn't just educate a justice. She educated us all. What unfolded in that chamber wasn't only about Brett Kavanaugh's discomfort. It was about a bigger truth, that the Constitution isn't marble, bound or robe protected. It's living, breathing, and it belongs to the people. The internet knew it instantly. Clips of Crockett's calm dismantling went viral within hours. Comments lit up feeds like fireworks. She bodied him without breaking a sweat. This was a constitutional masterclass. The courtroom turned into a classroom, and Kavanaugh was the student. Moments like this don't come often. And when they do, they remind us of something deeper. Power bends, but truth stands. Crockett stood for every person who's been told their voice doesn't matter, and her composure turned that hearing into history. So now I'll ask you, if you were in that courtroom, whose side would you have been on? Was this the coldest clapback of the year? And more importantly, do you believe the Constitution belongs to the people, not just the powerful? If you do, hit subscribe, because this moment may have ended, but the next one, that fight is already coming.